Welcome to JAT Chat, presented by the Journal of Athletic Training, the official journal of the National Athletic Trainers Association. I'm Dr. Kara Radzak, an associate professor in the School of Integrated Health Sciences at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and your host for today's JAT Chat. I'm joined by Dr. Eric Post and Dr. Travis Anderson, the authors of the recently published Multiplying Alpha When Statistical Tests Compound in Sports Medicine Research, which was recently published in the Journal of Athletic Training. Dr. Eric Post is the manager of Sports Medicine Research Laboratory for the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. Eric previously has served as program director for Masters in Athletic Training program at Indiana State University and is faculty member at San Diego State University. Dr. Travis Anderson recently joined U.S. Soccer as the manager of research and innovation there, following his work as a research scientist at the USOPC, where he worked closely with Eric. His academic background is in exercise physiology, though he's dabbled in statistics throughout his graduate school time and enjoys continuing his education in applied statistics within sports medicine and exercise science. Thank you so much, Travis and Eric, for taking the time to speak with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So, what motivated you to write this article, especially when statistics is such a scary topic for many who might be reading the Journal of Athletic Training, both us researchers and also clinicians?
Yeah, so I think this paper was really born from just conversations that Eric and I had in the office, as some of the best research ideas tend to come from. And we were initiating a project with the Paris Olympic and Paralympic Games coming up, and we were thinking through some of the things we wanted to do with the data that we were going to be collecting at the Games. And we knew that part of that was going to be a big exploratory analysis that we wanted to conduct. So we started thinking of ways of being able to control, and I'm sure we'll get into this, experiment-wise error. And then we just got to chatting. It was like, did you learn about this in graduate school during your statistics training? Did you have any formal training on how to deal with this as an issue? And we sort of asked around some of our colleagues, and was this ever covered in your formal statistics training? And we soon came to realize that we all had very similar statistics background and formal training, and these sort of things weren't really talked about a whole lot. And there are really good reasons why. There's limited time in those courses to be able to go through, some of these techniques and some of these ideas. So, we totally get it. But we also recognize that as clinicians or researchers are reading or conducting their own research, these ideas are important to consider. And sometimes we fall back on heuristics or just sort of assumed knowledge, and we don't really question where that information or those heuristics really came from. And so we thought maybe this was just an opportunity, just as a refresher, to get it back out into the sports medicine community and just sort of revamp the conversation a little bit around some of these issues.
Yeah, Kara, I'd say, just to add to what Travis said, I think, it's always great when you have somebody with a really strong analytical skill set on your team like Travis has, because they don't take things for granted. And I think, I've definitely fallen into this routine in my academic career where you kind of use the same tests over and over again, or you use the same analysis over and over again, whatever you learned, in your coursework, as opposed to thinking about why are we doing this and what are the limitations or what are some of the issues with certain ways that we do things. And so, yeah, this exploratory analysis we had to think about this, and that made us think, okay, how much often is this going on in kind of sports medicine research, which led to this editorial.
Add me to the group that didn't really get this very much in their doctoral work. Yeah. This is why it's so important to be talking about these things, right? And kind of raising the issue of maybe we are not trained as appropriately as we should be, right? But also, like, things move and things change. And so for the clinicians who might not have a deep statistical background, how would you explain, kind of in plain language, the two things that you really dive into, this family-wise error rate and experiment-wise error rate?
So I'll try and take the highest view possible, and then we'll drill down a little bit. But I think most clinicians or researchers within sports medicine are usually trained within this sort of frequentist inference framework. And that's really the framework that we're talking about here when it comes to these errors that we're talking about.
Can you give us an example of like frequentist framework statistics?
So in a frequentist framework, what you're really doing is trying to take a sample from the population, hopefully randomly sampled from the population, and the statistics that you're running, you're trying to infer what is happening in the population, given the ability to resample from that population at a high enough frequency. So in the long run, is this what we expect to see in the population? That's really the framework that most people sort of learn when they learn about t-tests and ANOVAs and different correlations. They normally do so from this frequentist framework, which is where we get p-values and these sorts of things from. There are other frameworks that Eric and I have been exploring more recently in sports medicine, like Bayesian frameworks, which is just a wholly different sort of conceptual model. But for the most part, this is what people are doing in research. They're fitting these models and they're looking at p-values and trying to make decisions about their hypotheses. So sort of within that framework, as I said, we're taking samples and we're trying to infer something to this population, and we want to go and formally test a hypothesis that we may have. Usually when we do that, what we want to do is select what's called an alpha level. And really what that is the probability that we would see a result at least as extreme as what we've seen in our collected data if there was no effect in the population. So this is really the probability that we're willing to accept a finding as being statistically significant when in fact there's no effect in the population. It's also called a false positive or type 1 error. So we go ahead and we fit our statistical test, and then if this p-value is less than our alpha level, which we usually set again at 5% or p less than 0.05, then we have a statistically significant finding. It's typically how that pattern goes. But because we're dealing with probabilities here, and we're doing this in a frequentist sense, we have to consider that if the alpha level is 0.05, we actually do expect to see this effect maybe 1 in 20 times on average, even if there is no true effect in the population.
Yeah. Kara, have you ever played Dungeons and Dragons?
No.
It may not surprise you.
I'm sure others
it may not
have.
surprise you to find out that I have. And so one way to think about this, what Travis is saying, the p-value, the alpha level is set at 0.05, of that 5% chance, right? And to what Travis just said, right? If we set that alpha level at 5% or 0.05, right? But the null hypothesis is actually true, in the long run, we do expect about 5% of the time to have a false positive result, right? When we're doing a study. And in the kind of frequentist school, as Travis said, we've accepted that as kind of an acceptable level for that type of error, right? To get it back to Dungeons and Dragons, which is where I'm hoping to go with this, if you take a 20-sided die, so, a 6-sided die would be what you'd see near you in Las Vegas, but a 20-sided die would be what you'd see, in a dorm room basement playing Dungeons and Dragons. You have a 1 in 20 chance. So any number on that 20-sided die, you expect to come up once every 20 rolls of the die, right? That's our alpha level. So if you say, okay, I'm willing to accept that if I roll this die and it comes up as a 1, right? That's your 1 in 20 chance. That's your alpha level, your false positive of 5%. The interesting thing is if you start to roll that die more than once, okay? And let's say you win if a 1 comes up at any point. Well, if you only roll it once, you only have a 5% chance of winning. But if you start to roll that die multiple times, right, the chance of getting at least one on one of those rolls continues to raise, okay? So by the time you've rolled the die 20 times, the probability of at least one winning number coming up is over 64%. Even though on any given roll, it's only 5%. So that's really the crux of what we're talking about within this editorial, is when you start to have these multiple statistical tests, they all have an alpha level of 0.05 independently, but now we're doing multiple tests within the same experiment, right? And that risk of having a false positive grows very quickly.
Yeah,
basically
exactly.
why a lot of people stay at the craps table.
Yes.
Yeah, you just need to roll enough sevens in a row.
That's right.
Yeah, but I think maybe to bring it back to some of the research that folks might be doing and some of the tests that we might be more familiar with. Let's consider something simple like an analysis of variance or an ANOVA model that most people are familiar with through their graduate training. Imagine you wanted to know whether there was a difference in vertical jump height across three different sports, for example. You measure everyone's vertical jump in soccer, volleyball, and basketball. And you run that ANOVA model, you get your F statistic out of it, and it says, yeah, there is a significant difference. You still don't know between which of those groups there is a significant difference. And so most people are comfortable with doing some sort of post hoc testing. So after you fit that ANOVA model to figure out where those differences may lie. And I think people in their training are very comfortable with this, and they know that they can do something maybe like a bond for Rogan correction when they do their post hoc tests to make sure they're not letting that error rate get too large. And this is typically what we mean by a family-wise error rate, is a family of tests sort of within the same hypothesis or domain. And I think people are pretty comfortable with that idea that you can have this family-wide error and that you need to control for it, such as in an ANOVA model. But there's this other phenomenon called experiment-wise error, where you can run multiple independent tests that may not be part of the same family, but they are part of the same experiment. And if you run enough of those, the same problem arises. So, for example, you may be wanting to test, you have some sort of training intervention and you may want to test whether people get fitter or not. So you measure their VO2 max and their lactate threshold and their, 20-meter sprint time. And then all of these sort of are separate hypotheses, but for each one of them, you're running an independent test where you're going to see error rate inflation in that context as well. And so all we're really saying here is people are probably comfortable with the family-wise error rate control, but we need to be doing it across entire experiments as well to make sure that we're correcting for that.
And so this is what you guys were really thinking of when you were looking at that Paris data or as you were planning to do it. So talk about that. I mean, you mentioned in the paper how you were doing a study that had 67 million regression models, right? Take us through that and how this applies.
Yeah. So 67 million is a large number for sure, but it's not unheard of really within biological sciences. There's plenty of fields that may have data points at least as large as this, and especially as computational power increases and the ability to collect data, the cost of that goes down. I think people are going to find themselves in a situation where they have all of this data that they need to analyze. So it's a little bit extreme, but maybe not an unheard of circumstance in that field. But yeah, so we had this study idea where we wanted to look at whether injury and illness that was sustained at the Paris Olympic Games, what is going to influence performance outcomes. And so we wanted to fit this model to figure out, well, does it impact an athlete's ability to win a medal, or does it impact where they're going to finish, their rank place finish, for example? But as we were thinking through it, we realized that injury and illness is too broad of a category. And so what we really needed to do was start to think about the specific types of injuries and illnesses that we were testing here. Because, as everyone can sort of surmise on their own, there's probably a difference between having a respiratory infection and having a dermatological illness, maybe a rash or something in terms of its effect on someone's performance. And so what we wanted to do is look at the different types of injuries and illnesses that we were getting at the games. And so in order to look at all of the possible combinations, we needed to fit all of these sort of independent models to look at their association with performance outcome. And so when you do the math, it comes out to be about 67 million models. So my laptop was on fire for a couple of weeks there. But essentially what we found at the end of all that is the number of significant models was a huge number, but it turned out to be about 4.4%, which is almost exactly the rate that you would expect under the null hypothesis, assuming an alpha level 0.05. And so we just thought that was a really interesting example of how this can happen in practice, the results that would be expected under the null hypothesis with this alpha level, And so we wanted to include it in the paper here as just an example of how this can materialize when doing this for sports medicine research.
Yeah, I think it's, kind of an elegant example that it lines up so closely to 5% and what we'd expect to see as a false positive. And we don't expect all those, 4.4% of models to be all false positive. We think there's some true signal in there. And we're excited for this paper to be coming out hopefully soon, where we can go into more detail. But, you know, a lot of times with these large data sets and large scale explorations, they're kind of hypothesis generating, right? It's hard to test them under these frequentist frameworks because of that risk of the high false positive rate, but it's good for kind of spotting potential patterns. And I would say, to Travis's point earlier about the experiment-wise error rate and the key kind of takeaway that we're trying to get across is, you know, if you read a paper that's reporting statistically significant results, but it's fitting a ton of models, maybe not 67 million models, but if it's fitting a lot of different models or running a lot of different tests and not doing any sort of correction for that number of tests, it's probably good to be a little bit skeptical of the results because, you can start to go fishing and you can start to find something that meets that alpha threshold if you run enough tests, essentially.
So, you kind of talked about that things that clinicians as they're reading should be looking for, but what are some of your recommendations, especially as we move into this new world of big data science, right? Should researchers be thinking about as far as how to handle these bigger data sets that we're getting the potential to have?
Yeah, so I would say transparency is usually king here. So things like pre-registration, massive. They're massive for a lot of reasons, and I really hope the field keeps moving in the direction of either requiring or encouraging pre-registration of studies, because it just adds that level of transparency of people saying, "Hey, we know going into this is completely exploratory. This is how we're going to do it. These are the methods that we think are appropriate." And so when you're reading that paper and the authors have adhered to the methods that they had previously set forth, it gives you more confidence that the authors aren't necessarily trying to mislead, for example. I think the pre-registration process also helps to think through these problems ahead of time and say, hey, we may actually be running into some of this experiment-wise error inflation. What are some methods we can use to address that ahead of time? So if a study's pre-registered, that's usually a green flag when going through these papers. And I know the statistics section in papers can often be pretty dry, and sometimes I'm guilty of it myself, of just sort of skipping through because I want to get to the practical application. But I think it's really important we try and pay attention there. Another reason it might be worth paying attention to the statistical method or the analytical approach is if a study in the results section is only reporting some of the outcomes that it said it measured and not reporting others, it's not necessarily disqualifying, but it's something that you may want to take a little bit more of a look at and say, is there maybe some reasons why they didn't include this? Maybe it's in a supplemental file somewhere. Maybe I can get in touch with the authors if I have questions about it. But usually, again, transparency is king. So as researchers or clinicians are writing their own papers, they really want to think ahead as well of making sure you're explaining why certain models were run, why you're presenting some results. And maybe not all of them, there are word limits and so forth in papers, but at least trying to be as transparent as possible. And then maybe one of the other things I would point to as something to look for to maybe to start asking more questions would be if there are multiple outcomes or multiple study endpoints, multiple dependent variables, really sort of scrutinizing, well, how did the authors deal with this? What was their approach to make sure that they weren't falling prey to this either family-wise or experiment-wise error inflation?
Yeah, I think one thing I would add there, just as kind of final piece, I think that's all great advice and great practical advice. And then I think, the final clinical piece would be just to kind of judge your intuition as a clinician and your clinical experience. And if you're reading through and something seems way against kind of what you have observed to be true in the world, or, really goes against kind of some of the assumptions you may have had, it doesn't mean that the results being presented are incorrect, but it's a good kind of maybe clue to listen to your gut and look a little bit deeper at the results and the methods.
Statistical significance doesn't always mean clinically meaningful.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly right. And also, like, you know, it may not mean anything if it's statistically significant. It may just truly be a false positive. And so that clinical intuition, which is why Travis and I are interested in things like Bayesian methods, because they incorporate that clinical intuition, I think are really interesting ways for the field to go. But that's a totally different podcast episode.
I don't know. Can you just tease us with like what are Bayesian like a very brief because that might be the first time somebody's hearing about a Bayesian method.
Yeah, Travis, maybe I'll try to do a very brief. This is usually how Travis and I's collaboration go is he says something brilliant and then I say something, you know, uneducated, and then it helps him refine his already brilliant idea a little bit further. So I'll start us off here and say, essentially it's just incorporating beliefs about the world, right? And then collecting new evidence and combining those two pieces into a new belief about the world and then repeating that cycle. And so it's a statistical framework that was really in vogue and in popularity up until the early 1900s. And then the frequentist methods started to predominate, largely coming out of agricultural science, which is kind of an interesting history. But, you know, they're much more intuitive with how people think about the world. And so sometimes, I like it because it is pretty simple on its face. It's really just what do we know and believe about the world? Let's gather some new evidence, but now let's combine those two sources of information to get a new understanding about the world. So it doesn't have things like p values. It doesn't kind of prescribe to a lot of the ways we think about statistics because we're taught kind of frequentist methods, but it aligns really well with how clinicians think about the world and how clinicians interact with patients and incorporate new evidence. And so I think it's really could be valuable within the sports medicine world.
Yeah, no, you absolutely hit the nail on the head, Eric. Yeah, no, it's to that point as well. I think it's intuitive for clinicians and practitioners to think about the world as a series of sort of probabilistic distributions. That might not sound intuitive, but I think that's the way most people intuitively think. There's a 60% chance of something happening today, for example. But yeah, probably the distinction between frequentist and Bayesian approaches I would suggest is that in a frequentist framework, oftentimes we think about the parameter of interest, maybe the mean, for example, as being a fixed value, and that it's the data that varies, right? It's the sampling from the population that varies. Whereas under the Bayesian framework, it's sort of flipped. So you think about the data as being fixed, the thing that you've collected that is a fixed entity, but the parameter actually varies within the population. And so it's sort of a different intuition, but Eric is right. It's sort of, you can simplify it as like we all believe something about the world. Let's go and get some information, collect some data. We'll combine those two, and now we'll think maybe something differently about the world, or maybe we won't. And the reason we and some others within the field are really excited about trying to get Bayesian methods into sort of more popular parlance and into the literature is because it offers the opportunity to include something like clinician beliefs. You can go out and you can talk to a clinician and say, do you think this modality is effective? How effective do you think it is? And you can incorporate that directly into your modeling process. And so it's a really powerful way of getting the clinician voice, the patient voice into the science that we're doing. And so, yeah, watch this space. But we're really excited about the opportunity.
So, where could potentially like researchers that these concepts might be somewhat newer to, or they just are dipping their toe into these ideas, maybe get some more knowledge on Bayesian approaches?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple papers, good papers that have come out recently. There's some landmark Bayesian papers in the field beyond sports medicine that we'd be happy to send over that are good kind of background reading. Avinash Chandran from Datalist just published a paper in Injury Epidemiology a couple months ago, 2 months ago, that's all about how to apply Bayesian frameworks in sports epidemiology specifically, since that's kind of his field with all the NCAA surveillance work. So I'd point to that paper for sure as kind of like this is kind of it gives a good broad overview of what these methodologies are. And then I think there's a lot of kind of resources in the kind of lay public that would be interesting for folks to check out. there's a book that's been out for, 2 decades now, The Signal and the Noise by Nate Silver. And he's done a kind of a lot of work in this space around election forecasting. And so there's great information there as well. So I would say it's kind of a combination. There's not a lot that people can go to in the sports medicine world yet, but hopefully soon. But there's a lot out there just kind of generally explaining it in the scientific and kind of lay literature. But Travis, any specific places you would advise people to go?
No, I think that's a great overview. There are obviously plenty of online resources that folks can check out. But yeah, we hope to get more of these studies and maybe editorials or explainers into the sports med specific journals and publications. And so we can, create a groundswell of folks within the community that are interested in this. Maybe to bring it full circle, though, I think it's interesting that the Bayesian approaches don't necessarily, automatically make this idea of multiplicity error correction go away. It's not a panacea for that, but what it does do is sort of change the incentive structure a little bit, because now you can make confidence statements without needing to hit some sort of binary cut point of it's statistically significant or it's not. And so it helps sort of frame your evidence in a way that's truthfully representing the data without sort of this incentive that that no one's going to find this meaningful if I'm not exceeding this threshold.
So, kind of in closing, if the sports medicine community is to adopt these recommendations tomorrow, how would research and even clinical decision making look different in 5-10 years from now?
Yeah, I think one of the things we're worried about and why we wrote this is essentially, if there's a lot of things out there being presented as significant evidence, as statistically significant evidence, but they're actually false positives, then there's no evidence for those things actually having any sort of effect in the population. So if those are informing clinical practice or guidelines, we're wasting resources, we're potentially putting patients at risk. And so we do think this is an important thing for people to be thinking about beyond just kind of the statistical kind of interest that we have. It has an actual impact on clinical care if guidelines are being driven by this. So our goal is, we have several ideas, about improving sports medicine research and rigor. Pre-registration is a big one. Sports medicine does not do pre-registration. It just is not a thing that happens within our field. And so if we can create kind of, as Travis said, a groundswell support for pre-registering studies, doing peer review of methods, and then the paper is accepted, and then the publication is, guaranteed whether or not there is a statistically significant finding, if it's using that type of framework, I think that'll go a really long way. Because what we need, if we can control type 1 error, right? If we can support replication studies as well, I think that's another really important piece, is to not just rely on evidence from a single study, but to be able to replicate that finding in a rigorous way over time. There's a great paper that came out a month or two ago in Sports Medicine where they did this large scale replication study more in kind of the exercise science space. But, things did not replicate well is kind of the takeaway from that. And so we need to be, pre-registering studies, supporting replication efforts, which are, sometimes journals don't necessarily want to publish replication studies because they're not novel. I think those two things would go in a really long way, in addition to some of the Bayesian methods we've talked about, adoption of those. I think within 5 to 10 years, you could start to see, the guidelines that we develop being based on a much stronger base of evidence. Right? If we can be more confident in the results that we're seeing, then ultimately the meta-analyses, the consensus statements, the things that come out of that original research, it's going to have a much stronger backing behind it. I guess that would be my wish for how this could lead to better research in clinical decision making in 5 years from now.
Yeah, no, I love that wish list, and I share the hope. I think we've sort of been talking about clinicians and researchers. We've also been talking about publishers a little bit. I think peer reviewers are a really critical piece of this as well. But just being aware that experiment-wise error control might need to be considered as you're peer reviewing papers. And, there's a responsibility there as well within the community to make sure that we're, enhancing the rigor of the studies that are coming through. And I would say that if people are doing all of the correct sort of corrections and they're being really rigorous with their statistical methods, that should be seen as a plus on the reviewer side. If they're doing all of this, even if they're not finding statistically significant effects, but they're doing it in such a rigorous way, that should be rewarded. And so I think we can maybe start to mindset shift a little bit as we're peer reviewing papers, because ultimately we want the most credible, the most trustworthy body of evidence that we can build these clinician guidelines off of, and that patients and athletes that folks are working with can then turn around and say, I trust my medical provider, and I trust that the things they're doing are backed by rigorous scientific evidence. And that's sort of the ultimate goal, is to improve clinical outcomes and keep athletes fit and healthy.
So, what is really making you hopeful or excited in sports medicine and sports science, exercise physiology in our fields right now? And it doesn't have to be related to this, but what are some things that you see that are going on that you're really, really stoked about?
Yeah, well, to Eric's earlier point, there is an acknowledgement that replication studies needed. I don't want to go as far to say there is a crisis, but there has been an early recognition that we need to start, really interrogating some of these effects or some of these commonly held beliefs within these fields, and that's really exciting because replication is sort of a cornerstone of being able to do and report good science. So really excited about that. Personally, I'm excited about the amount of data that is now being collected in somewhat of a passive sense. I think there is a whole host of interesting research questions that can be asked without needing to necessarily go out and do more science. We can just do better science with the data that's already being collected. I would say as well, obviously, tools like R as a statistical programming language and Python, and just the compute power that we have now makes it more realistic that we can start to look at this data in an exploratory way and find interesting connections. Again, being very transparent about what we're trying to do and attempting to do with those data. And I also think it's never been a better time to try and learn these sort of statistical methods, because we have things like ChatGPT or other large language models that are really, really helpful for debugging code and maybe giving you interesting ideas about a type of model that you may not have considered in the past. So it's sort of never been a better time to jump in and try to analyze all this data that we're collecting.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I don't have much to add to that. I kind of follow Travis for where things are going exciting, that are exciting in the field and where things are headed. I think what's really cool from as a former athletic trainer clinician mindset, sports medicine is a really young field relative to biology and, psychology and these other fields that exist. And those fields have gone through major crises in terms of replication, in terms of rigor, in terms of their results. And we as a young field have the opportunity to learn from that. And the fact that that recognition is already happening and is being published by, the major journals in the field, including Journal of Athletic Training, is exciting because I think there's already an acknowledgement. If we can learn from what other fields have done, we can take that information and we can make our science stronger as a result, which will ultimately help the patient at the end of the day.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Post, Dr. Anderson, thank you again so much for joining me today and making statistics exciting. We really appreciate you joining us. And just for everybody listening, this paper, as well as all of the offerings through the Journal of Athletic Training, are available open access. So thank you again.
Thank you.